Okay, I'm going to get started in like 2 minutes. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Hi, Leah. Thank you for joining. Gonna get started in 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, I guess we can get started to respect the folks in the room. Welcome to Bail Aid Virtual Action as a part of Unurbanist Assembly 2022. I am Sarah Bond, a program manager with the Thrivance Group, also led the planning of this year's Unurbanist. So, yeah, really excited to be here and share this with you all on this effort. We are like, did we pass the midnight? Okay, we are past midnight. So we on the East Coast. So if you are still here, thank you so much for holding us down. So today I will be talking about the bailout fund that we will be raising funds to support. I'm going to give a little information about bonds and bail aid and how that process can be harmful, especially as that aligns with our theme of decarceration and spatial reparations for this year's assembly. So if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I will say I am also still learning about this process. And so this is very much so an open space for us to kind of understand these issues together and also, raise proceeds to go to this amazing organization that's doing great work in Chicago. So I'm going to get started. So this is some artwork by an artist that works for the Chicago Community Bond Fund. It says money, bail is ransom, and pretrial incarceration. So we're going to unpack this a little bit more, but I really urge you all to think about, how the way we think about bail. I think it's so normalized in our society at this point. But, when we think about the capitalist society to which we live in and, low wealth people and people that come from poverty or don't come from money, and how that links to having more interactions or being more likely to end up incarcerated or in prison or jails, and how that just like perpetuates the cycle of disparity and oppression, oftentimes in Black and Brown communities. So it's definitely something that we really have to talk about more and understand the process and just what it all means. So money bond and pretrial incarceration. So, every year there are people that are incarcerated every year there are people that are sentenced. And while they are awaiting trial to be, charged or to face the judge, they are, in many instances, the only way for them to have freedom is to pay a bond. And many people, because of their income, because of their status, because of their identity, because of their reality, are not able to pay a money bond. I mean, many people, if someone asked you to pay $5,000 tomorrow, and you were in jail, like, I couldn't pay it. If someone called me and was like, hey, do you have this to bail me out? I couldn't pay it. So, and I know that is the reality for many people. So it's just something we should think about as we're having this conversation. Is we're asking people for lump sums of cash to have freedom, and they're not even, sentenced or charged with guilty yet. So that in itself is hypocritical and harmful. But as a result of not being able to pay bond, people lose their jobs, they can lose housing, sometimes, their custody of their children. All of these things can be impacted by a system of money bonds that prevents people from purchasing their pretrial freedom. So these harms also create instability in their lives and make us less safe. Again, because, if tomorrow something were to happen and I was charged and I couldn't pay the bond, what would that look like for me? But what would that also look like for someone that had even less privilege that I have, or they have children, or they are, unhoused, or, just these many layering things that can change someone's reality. And when you face that with the carceral system and, tell people they have to pay to be free, it just perpetuates the cycle of harm. So it also says that, people incarcerated pretrial are more likely to be convicted, receive harsh sentences than those who are free while awaiting trial. So again, we're punishing people for having low income, having low wealth. So it's sad when you think about it. Just to give some context about me, like, my last name is Bond. So, and I just made that connection. But growing up, I grew up in Baltimore City, and there's bailout bonds everywhere. And I also have a parent that is incarcerated. So, the logos for these bail bonds shops that they have on corners, and they have the person wearing the stereotypical black and white hat and the uniform. It's all coming up for me in the moment. So just giving some context and things that are coming up for me. So I'm going to play a video, which will be a good opportunity for me to get my thoughts together. I'm sorry, 1 second. Okay, so we're just gonna watch a 4-minute video and see if I can put the.
Cook County Jail is located in the middle of Chicago. It's the largest single-site jail in the United States. It stretches 11 city blocks, and more than 70,000 people pass through the jail each year. On any given day, more than 6,000 people are locked up behind bars in Cook County Jail. 95% of them are there pre-trial, meaning that they are waiting for trial and are therefore presumed innocent. More than a third are there only because they can't afford to pay a money bail.
When a person is given money bail, it means that a judge has determined that they are cleared for release. The money bail amount is supposed to be based on what the accused person is able to pay, not the nature of the charges against them. Having the income necessary to afford a money bail should not be the difference between someone walking free or being locked up in jail. Money bail isn't supposed to be a form of pre-trial punishment.
For decades, however, the court has been doing just that, punishing people simply because they are too poor to pay a money bail. Judges have been unconstitutionally setting money bails well beyond what accused people can actually afford to pay in order to keep them in jail.
People who cannot pay, who are disproportionately black and brown, are incarcerated for the duration of their cases. By setting money bails above what people can pay, judges are effectively treating people as if they're guilty until proven innocent.
Incarcerating people pre-trial severely disrupts their lives and the lives of their family. Just a few days in jail can cause someone to lose their job and housing. After a month, essential benefits are cut off. Longer term, some people locked up pre-trial risk losing custody of their children or are forced to take plea deals, all because they were given a money bail that they could not afford to pay.
But people are organizing and fighting back. Around the country, groups like Chicago Community Bond Fund raise money to pay people's money bails and support them while they're fighting their cases. When the case ends, the bail money comes back to CCBF and is used to free someone else. That process has helped CCBF free more than 150 people from Cook County Jail.
While bail funds are a great way to help people immediately, they are not the solution to money bail. That's why communities around the country are organizing to end money bail and pre-trial incarceration altogether. In Chicago, CCBF is working with the Coalition to End Money Bond to change policies so that fewer people enter Cook County Jail in the first place.
We all have a role to play in the fight to end money bail. Alongside people who are currently or formerly incarcerated and their loved ones, we must tell their stories and fight for their freedom. We can make sure that pretrial incarceration is eliminated by challenging the constitutionality of the current system, winning policy changes, holding the courts accountable to pretrial release, and advocating for resources for criminalized communities. There are a lot of ways to help, and this fight is going to take all of us.
It will take you. Part of the reason why this unjust system of money bail has been allowed to thrive is because it benefits people in power. The realities have been known to the individuals and communities who have been directly and disproportionately impacted by its violence. Each of us can help share those people's stories, lift up their voices, build awareness of how this system is ripping our communities apart, and then take action. No longer will we stand for this.
Together, we can end money bail and pretrial incarceration, not just in Illinois, but across the United States.
Let's hold this system accountable and bring more people home.
Great. I really like the framing of that as a call to action. And I think that is in the nature of Unurbanist. You know, we are here to, I think, play our part in advocating for those who are less privileged, those who are not being advocated for, those who are often forgotten. So I am really grateful for that video. Okay, I'm just going to go back to full screen to finish this presentation. I'm so bad at doing the you know, when it's like the Zoom thing is at the top, but you can't get to the whatever. So today, and we're going to be doing a bail fund call to action to fundraise for BBO, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But we just wanted to also share more about some lessons from the Chicago Community Bond Fund. So over the last several years, Cook County has been leading the way in pretrial justice reform. And one example of that, they began their work in 2016 when there were 8,500 people incarcerated. And by 2019, the number was reduced to around 6,000 people per day. So in the name of decarceration, Chicago Community Bond Fund was doing the work. And so this reduction can be attributed to the decreased use of unaffordable money bonds under the General Order 188A. So this is a major milestone for the criminal legal system, a major milestone for decarceration, and something that we can all continue to learn from. And as one example, one case study of an organization that is doing the work and is getting the results. So we also want to, not in just the name of, making people pay to get out to have their freedom pretrial is bad, but also it's better for the quality. It's better for safety. So these reforms have taken place without jeopardizing community safety. So there's this, misconception that if you allow people to, pretrial to be on the streets, that somehow our streets are not safe, whatever that means. But this case study says that during the same years that the number of people in Cook County jail declined by more than 40%, Chicago has actually experienced an overall reduction in violent crime by almost 8% when compared to the same period in 2017. So in fact, we argue that pretrial incarceration is actually making our community safer. Thousands of people who are presumed innocent are now able to return to work, to take care of their families, to care for their children, and to be removed from the carceral system to heal, to have community healing, to be a part of their community, to be shopping at their local stores. As a result, they are less likely to be convicted and will also receive shorter sentences. So pretrial freedom means that bond reform actively contributes to the bettering of our communities and well-being. So again, this is another case study and argument of why this is actually beneficial to our communities to have pretrial release, and something that we should be advocating for. So the Pretrial Fairness Act in Illinois, shout out to Illinois, shout out to Chicago, like amazing things happening there, first of all. But the Pretrial Fairness Act passed on January 13, 2021. So the CCBF was thrilled to start the year with the passage of this act, development partners. And basically what this means is that it will end money bond in Illinois and dramatically decrease the number of people in pretrial incarceration across the state. So this was signed into law by the government. We're considering this is definitely a win for this work. And this was the result of a 5-year campaign with community groups across Cook County. So folks are really organizing and coming together to attack this issue. And I'm happy to be a part of this conversation with Unurbanist. So, as a call to action to the folks in the room to also be, pushing us to be a part of this work and to advocate for this. So today, the reason why we're all here is to raise money for the Believers Bailout Fund in Chicago. And I want to share a video about Believers Bailout.
In the United States, we spend over $182 billion a year on the criminalization and incarceration of millions of people. 1 out of every 3 adults has a criminal record. The same number of people have criminal records as have 4-year bachelor's degrees.
The rapid spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and its disparate impact in Black and Latinx communities demonstrates how risk and vulnerability are poorly managed by the state and corporate interests.
Our incarcerated kin are particularly vulnerable at this time. They have not been able to socially isolate themselves, and many do not have adequate access to even the most basic of necessities like clean water and soap.
This should not be a death sentence for them. It has also shown our ability as individuals to respond to the needs of others in heroic ways.
Believers Bailout believes that another society is possible. Our faith requires us to reimagine and build communities where we do not put people in cages and where we can all live lives of dignity.
Thousands of people sit in cages because they cannot afford to pay money bail. Using Zakat-eligible donations, Believers Bailout has freed 38 believers from pretrial and immigration incarceration and provided them with post-release support ranging from rugs to pray on, to food, and mental health and spiritual support.
We also work in coalitions in the fight to end money bond and the other injustices of our criminal punishment system.
Please join us by donating your Zakat and Sadaqah to bail out believers from pretrial and immigration incarceration.
Because we are a community, we're a neighborhood, we're a people. We're someone's loved ones, we're someone's mother, we're someone's father, we're someone's children.
Join us this Ramadan on the steeper of two roads.
Amazing. For folks that are in the room, I know that just learning about BBO as I was making this presentation has been really humbling to see the work that they do. Just curious if folks in the chat or in the room are familiar with the organization, if anyone has any more to share, advocate for them. We really are aligned in many ways, but specifically to see what they're doing for the Muslim community. So just to give a little recap of that video, Believers Bailout, or BBO, is a community-led effort to bail out Muslims in pre-trial incarceration and also ICE custody. So this is a Chicago-based organization home to the largest single-site jail in the United States. The BBO supports efforts to abolish money bail and to raise awareness within Muslim communities on the injustices of the bail bond system, immigration bonds, and broader prison industrial complex topics. So their aim is to move towards a world rooted in accountability, love that, and healing rather than punitive responses of the police and prisons. They seek to create sustainable change in our society by focusing on 3 major areas of concern: the prison industrial complex, anti-Muslim racism, and anti-Blackness. So zakat, one of the central tenets of Islam, is an annual tax on wealth. The Quran 960 specifies 8 uses for zakat, including helping the poor and the needy and for the freeing of slaves or captives. People being held in pretrial incarceration, often because they can't afford, qualify for zakat. So by paying their bill and freeing them to address these charges, BBO restores their presumption of innocence. So it is in our capacity and their duty as Muslims to be a part of the ending of this unjust bail system that criminalizes poverty and inherently racist in nature. So all funds towards the zakat are directed towards bond-related costs. This includes money bail and related fees, transportation, correspondence, and post-release support, housing, mental health services, and other needs. And so all of these are paid for through grants. One thing I think is really interesting here is, how this organization is overlapping with religion. And I think within the cultural system, religion is very important. And so I think, oftentimes folks that are incarcerated look to religion. So for example, like my dad converted to Islam while he's been incarcerated. So yeah, I think it's something special about the work that they're doing with the Sakat funds. So basically, again, the reason why we're here today, we are imploring you all to donate to BVO and to be a part of this bailout virtual action as alignment with the Unurbanist Assembly. So ways that you can pay, you can scan this QR code that my colleague Nevi made for us. Thank you so much to make this seamless. So if you're able to scan the screen to donate, you also can pay with Venmo or QuickPay using this email. You can also go to their website, which we can also drop in the chat. So I want to keep this screen up. So just for the rest of our time to have folks to donate, but anyone in the room already donated that want to share and inspire others. Does anyone want to talk about, how they've been impacted by bailout funds or, their relationship to this topic, pretrial incarceration? We welcome you into the space to, I guess you can't speak, to maybe put in the chat in the Q&A. Yeah, the chat is open. So if anyone wants to share. But yeah, we really hope that you choose to donate. And this is something that is important to us and something that I've learned a lot in just doing this work with Unurbanist and doing this presentation. So I hope that we all stay tuned in to the work that's being done in Chicago, and also stay tuned in with the work that BVO is doing. Again, I'm just going to leave this up on the screen. If anyone has anything, I will leave the chat open for the remainder of the time. And again, if you are able to donate, that would be great. If you want to share with folks, that would be amazing. So thank you so much for your time. Yeah, just gonna leave this up for the next session, which is a very exciting session that will begin at in 15 or less than 15 minutes from now. It is our informal economies keynote address, which will be very powerful. So we hope that you join us for our late night keynotes. We are up in this 23-hour assembly, so really appreciate you for being here at our later hours. Yeah, I'm gonna mute myself and keep this up. So see you all at 1:30. Thank you. Thank you, Aaliyah. Yes, please check them out. Stay in the know with the work that they're doing. We definitely value the work that's happening in Chicago. So thank you so much, everyone. We maybe have one more person that joined. We are doing a call to action to raise donations for BBO. Have someone in the chat. Oh, okay. Yes, donate. Oh, I guess I can. 1 second, y'all. Gonna pause my share. Okay, so never mind. I'm just going to. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started with informal economies in just a second. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. No? Unmute myself. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, awesome.
Full screen.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on informal economies. Okay. Think everyone can see me?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay. So my name is Salem, and I'm going to be leading us through a conversation around informal economies. To get started, I just wanted to set our intention around this being a session on world building. So we're going to sit with the question of how people who have been excluded from our mainstream acknowledgements of economic development and how they've built livelihoods for themselves and enriched our communities in the process. My praxis is built from an African diasporic standpoint. So there will be examples from the diaspora, all across the diaspora, the US, the continent, and different parts of where Black people live and love and work. So to kind of ground this work, I'm going to share a little bit about the process of how this conversation is going to go. First, we're going to define terms. So just make sure that everyone is thinking the same things when we're talking about informal economies. Who constitutes an informal economy? What constitutes an informal economy? We're going to spend some time discussing the value add of informal economies on industry and dive deeper into what support looks like. So a little bit about me. I am Salem, like I said. I am a human rights lawyer. I have a background in policy, legislation work, and I'm really passionate about world building. I'm passionate about well-being and equity and how we fuse these things together to create a built environment as well as intimate communities that are supportive of our collective well-being. So to get started for why everyone's excited to be here in this conversation, we're going to define some terms. So an informal economy is defined as an activity of trade that occurs outside of the formal labor market. And it's typically characterized by one, two, or three of these things. One of them is there's typically no state monitoring or regulation, there's no real wage protection, and there's no taxation present in that industry. The informal economy tends to be stigmatized as illegal, underground, black market, gray market, sometimes called the shadow economy and characterized as illegal or unethical activity. We know that these are all attempts to delegitimize the work that Indigenous people do. And so I think in diving deeper into this conversation, I hope this begins to be a red flag when an industry or a particular type of work is automatically characterized as black market or illegal or underground because we just don't have state regulations to legitimize that. So an interesting statistic from the International Labor Organization is that 61% of the world's workers actually earn a living in an informal way. That means more people than not work outside of the formal established lines of industry. So that means there's a reason why this is worth doing and worth investigating, worth studying, because a lot of people have found that this works for them. And in the same breath, the International Labor Organization actually focuses a lot on transitioning informal economies to formal industries as a poverty alleviation mechanism. They feel, and a lot of policy people feel, like the informal economy is discriminatory because there are no wage protections. They feel like it's easy to get away with things that harm the community, but it's because there's no state monitoring and regulation. But as we've talked about through this time, a lot of times when the state becomes involved in regulating and monitoring what we do, then it becomes a way to police the ways that we're providing value to our own communities. And so the problem with the transition from informal to formal, as I see it, is that then there becomes high taxation, high regulation, high cost of doing business in a way that just does not make doing the business profitable and often leads to disinvestment from people who otherwise might have enjoyed providing for their community in specific ways. So before we move on, I want to tell you all a little bit of a personal story that really connects me to this work. When my mother was pregnant with me, she just could not hold down a job. because it was a really difficult pregnancy for her. And so one of the things she found as she was, intuitively listening to her body was that she could not use any form of like dairy, of cow milk. So she had to basically cut off most forms of dairy from her diet during that time. As she tried to supplement her diet, she found soybean milk. And at the time in Nigeria, there's really no like formal soybean milk process, at least where we lived and grew up in. So she would go to a local farmer who grew soybeans and buy some soybeans, and really experimented with the ways that she could find the flavor that worked, with like pounding it and then milking it and drinking it. And she really felt like that helped stabilize her hormones during her pregnancy, and was just a really helpful, a really sweet source of joy for her in a pregnancy where she could not like eat almost anything, couldn't keep anything down. And so she began to find ways to like tell other people about it, and just would go door to door and tell other pregnant people who she would find that, oh, if you're having any trouble with these things, look into soybean milk. And then locally in the community, specific people started asking her for how to like make it, for her recipe, what part she was using of what, who was her soybean supplier. And eventually it became a business. It became a thing that she did. And she started producing soybean for people, going door to door, taking orders. And like 2 to 3 times a week, she would distribute those orders. And that really brought her so much joy during the end of her pregnancy. And after she had me, she stopped working in that business. But that's a very apt example of this kind of informal industry, right? Where one person finds something that works for them, and they immediately want to share that with a friend. And then it becomes like this organic way of building community around products that may be helpful to us, around things that we love to share. And so that whenever she tells the story, it's always really struck me as really powerful, really important. And the things that the way she would not have been able to do that if the industry was heavily regulated, if she had to get specific types of permits to be able to make soybean to sell door to door, if she needed to get a business license to do what she was doing, if she needed access to specific types of soybean to be able to be recognized as someone who actually knew what she was doing, right? But this is something that was not harmful to her, was well researched by her, and she was able to share it with her community at a price point that was accessible to everyone in her community. And so I think about that work, and I think of so many other people who I want us to like think through and ground this conversation in, as we think about the informal communities that exist, the informal economies that exist within our own communities. I'm going to share a slide with a few more pictures, but as we go through these pictures, I just want you to think through some of the people who do the work of building our communities, because they're not always industries. They're not always the big things that we think about. They're people like this first picture, the woman who sells like her peppers, the peppers and tomatoes in some West African country, right? Like these are people who build economies. These are people who are responsible for how we eat. And it's highly unregulated. Like these are informal industries. So think of informal industries, I think of market women. I think of herbalists, really our community herbalists, people who grow plant medicine and offer it to the community at a price point that's accessible. I think of people who are artists, right? And who are able to bring other people along through the gifts, the skills, the talents that they have. I think of, the people who sell things outside of their door. This is very common in different West African countries, but if you're just walking down the street, people just set up shop outside of their house and be selling tomatoes and apples and fruits. And most of these things are things that they grow or have relatives who grow. And so they built economies out of just knowing that they get to be home. They get to have, if they're moms, if they're people with children, they get to stay at home while still building out these economies and financially taking care of themselves and providing support in spaces that may be food deserts. I think of the local barbershop, the hair shop, the homegirl who does hair from her home, right? These are informal economies. And so my proposition then is rather than channeling our resources into creating pathways for industrialization, what would it look like if we actually supported and resourced informal economies so that our communities would be supported by these industries by these people who already support us in informal ways. A joke slash quote I talk about a lot is, I say everything I know about running a successful business I learned from African market women. My grandmother was a market woman. She organized one of the largest protests in Nigerian history against missionaries and the Nigerian government. It is known as the Aba Women's Riot of 1920. It's kind of a false characterization on Western media of what happened, but essentially it was an underground like organizing of market women almost all over the country that protested excessive taxation of their informal economies. And so when I think of these women, when I think of these people who have protested and who have really stood up to say, like, we don't want our industries heavily regulated. We want to be able to work in these informal ways. I hope that we can see and think through ways to resource that work rather than immediately trying to bring in big industries into the communities that we're part of. For the following reasons. I think that informal economies are worth protecting because they do an incredible amount of market research. So when you think of, in the economic development world that I work within, we pay so much to external consultants to come in, to study things, to do the market research of what communities need. However, most of the people who exist in these communities already know what their communities need because they're present, because they're having conversations, because they live there, because most of the people who work in these communities have intimate relationships. And so rather than hiring external people, most of the people who are involved in informal economies know what their communities need. They're attuned to the local needs. They also build their businesses and have a really solid, loyal customer base because their businesses are built out of trust, care, and attentiveness. So, one of the pushbacks against like informal economies is there's really no way to ensure that the businesses actually support the communities, and there's no way to regulate and protect quote unquote vulnerable people from people who would prey on them because of their industries and the businesses they're building. However, if you've ever been to, if you've ever had your hair braided by someone who's really terrible at braiding hair, you know that word goes around, right? Like after the first time you get your hair braided, it goes around. People are like, yeah, she's a little too tough with my hair, or she's a little too unprofessional for me. She is not on time, right? Like word goes around, and people within our communities have ways of disseminating information on who's trustworthy, who is attentive, who is caring. And we don't necessarily need access to external supports for some of those things, right? Another real important reason is that most of these people who are involved in informal economies have deeply rooted investments in the communities they work within. They care about local prosperity because, like I said earlier, sometimes they live and work within the same community, right? And so you will very rarely find people as deeply committed to the prosperity of the space, of the local community, than the people whose livelihood depends on community prosperity, right? And so already, rather than bringing in a Google to do a tech incubator or something in an economy, if you have people who are already doing that work in that economy, they'll do it with the level of care because they live here, because they work here, because the well-being of one is the well-being of all within that community. And also they're more times than not able to effectively organize around community safety. So when we talk about community safety, I've been to a couple of sessions in the last few hours where really sat down with the idea of decarceration and like what are the alternative models to accessing safety within our communities. And one of the things that I think about a lot is a story that happened in my local market group when I was young. So there was a woman who was experiencing domestic violence, and she was someone who, shopped frequently at the local market that was in my Nigerian community. And so lots of people knew her, and lots of people, may not have known what was going on in her life, but they had access to her. And because she had this routine of when she would come to the market, when she wouldn't come, when she would ask people to watch her children. Whenever she was off of her routine, some of the other women would organize to go check in on her. And eventually she was able to build support and leave the domestic violence, the intimate partner violence situation that she was in, because she had that support, because people knew what was going on with her, because they knew her routine. They knew when she was off of her routine. And so when community members are involved in the day-to-day living, working, and intimacy of their own, they're able to recognize when spaces may not be safe, when people may not be safe, and they can warn other people. And we've seen this as models so many times when in different communities, someone is like, an older Black lady pulls you in and it's like, oh, I see you're hanging around this person, like, watch your back or something. Just making sure that there's safety is something that informal economies allow us to have more access to when they're invested in. We also have this idea of successful peer and intergenerational relationships when informal economies are invested in. With spaces, with the creation of economies, with the creation of businesses, we automatically find spaces to offer support to each other. So you think of like your local nail salon spa or your local barber shop, right? These are already spaces of community. These are spaces that allow for successful peer relationships where Black people, Indigenous people, people of color can go to access community, like peer support, where they can build peer relationships, where we can also access intergenerational support, where we see other people who are navigating life's issues and we can talk about them openly. And these economies are worth protecting because they offer us access to relationships that we may not otherwise have access to out in the world. And finally, another reason why I would propose the protection of informal economies is that more times than not, the services that are provided by informal economies, when they have been vetted by community and trusted by community, tend to be more accessible because the pricing is set for the people, it is by the people. If the prices go up a little more than people are willing to pay, people just won't pay for them. Right. And so these economies are able to be attuned to the specific needs, the specific pricing needs of the people that they work within. So that being said, right, how can we support informal economies? I'm hoping that's kind of made people veer on the side of like, okay, let's protect informal economies. So what do we do? How do we support them? First thing we can do is to acknowledge the value add that these informal economies bring. And so I've shared about, my previous slide, I shared about 5 things, but as you think through the informal economies in your own community, it's important to like know what they add to your community. It's important to specify that, to add that to the value that they provide and communicate that out so that we understand and other people who are outsiders to the community understand that these are the things that these people, these communities, these businesses allow us to do. These are the things that they make possible because they're here. To communicate that. It is also important for us to help protect informal economies from excessive regulation because the thing about informal economies is that there is no organizing body and there's often no no advocacy group committed to these informal economies. So they don't have access to protection from regulation. And so when you see, the government specifically trying to crank down on a particular industry, they become very vulnerable because there's no protection. I would also propose community support, right? And so when we think through the ways that our non-melanated counterparts support the school systems, right? Like with their property taxes or with the bake sales or things like that, they've recognized that, hey, this is a space that matters to us. This is a space that matters to the well-being of our children. And so we're going to be bullish almost in selling these bake sale cupcakes, to everyone in my office because we want to support this thing, because we want to support this space. And in the same way, I think, or similar ways, we could do a little more support, like throw block parties to support community businesses. We could do things that disseminate the resources that we already have in the support of these businesses. We could also provide them with resources to scale so that while so many informal economic businesses are not interested in scaling, there are a few who might be interested in scaling, who might be interested in hiring people, who might be interested in getting legal support and registering their businesses, but often don't have access to the resources to scale, and often don't have spaces to even dream about what scaling could look like, what models could be sustainable for them to scale their business. And so we could also provide them with resources to scale if there's interest expressed in scaling their businesses. A big one, I think, which we all do, is referrals, right? So when you find something that you love, you share it with a friend. Tell them to share it with a friend, right? That's a very organic way to support these informal economies rather than going somewhere else across town to go access the same resource. Really digging deep into why we feel the need to go externally to access resources that we may already have internally. Similar to protection from excessive regulation, we could also make some attempts to fight against criminalization and policing of these informal businesses. So for instance, when there's like a local park ordinance that says you can't sell your shea butter at the park, right? Like that's an attempt to criminalize and police informal economy. Or when children are not allowed to like go door to door because of these neighborhood ordinances to ask to if they can mow your lawn for like $10, right? Like that's an attempt to police and criminalize informal economies. And so we could be noticing these attempts to criminalize and police and fight back against them. And finally, I think we need to ensure that the people who support informal economies have their participation in community engagement work and in participatory budgeting processes. So many people who do community work don't come from the communities that they do community work within. And it's important for us to push back against that by centering the people who run these informal economies because of their knowledge of the communities in community engagement efforts that we work within, to have them compensated for those efforts and to have them decide on participatory budgeting processes, how funding is going to be spent within their communities, because they are important community resources for us. So so that's it. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope that I've been able to offer some value around informal economies, how we can support them, the value add that they provide to our communities. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn at Salem Afangide, which is my name, and my business, Afangide Global, does some consulting and coaching around equity and well-being and policy work. So if you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on all social media. Thank you all so much to the Thrivance group for the opportunity to be here with you all and share my expertise. And I think that's it for me.
They're investing in working very, very hard. But workers are not gaining their fair share of an ever-expanding economic pie. And why is that?
People all across the country working in jobs once considered middle class, but now living far below a middle class lifestyle.
A majority of U.S. workers have experienced a decade of flat wages,
while income inequality has shot up by as much as 50%.
People just are hustling because they don't have a job, they don't have a job that make ends meet, and they have to hustle to put food on the table.
The number of part-time jobs is soaring.
Are we redefining work here?
This is the future of work, Jim.
We are at a turning point. Good jobs are not being created and are disappearing.
It's a survival economy, particularly for low-income people who are systematically excluded from the labor market.
The workers who make up the informal economy are the most marginalized workers in the country. They are people of color, they are immigrants, they are women.
This inequality that we've been experiencing, this insecurity, is related to informal labor, is related to the fact that workers are not being protected the way they should.
What we've seen in the last 40 years is perhaps the greatest shift of income and wealth from the broad middle class to very wealthy people in this country. And it wasn't by accident.
At the end of the day, America is an idea. It's an idea about how do you construct a democratic society.
The social contract that most of us have in our mind, the bargain that we make with society as a whole, says that we should be able to access relatively stable, relatively secure employment, that basic labor standards, such as minimum wages, health and safety on the job, the right to overtime pay when we work more than 40 hours.
We've never actually lived up to the idea of a social contract. We've exalted it in our documents, but the reality of its application in the world of policy and law has fallen far short.
If you look at undocumented immigrants that are facing challenges in the labor market, African American or Latino communities that have high rates of underemployment and unemployment, women whose work has been devalued historically, you see these populations disproportionately within the informal economy. The informal economy for many years was regarded as something that occurred elsewhere. It was a phenomenon of developing economies. The view was that the United States had progressed beyond this.
The early work on the informal economy was really focusing on a sector that was supposed to disappear over time as economies modernized. What we now realize is that this is not happening, this has not been happening, and in fact, the informal economy seemed to have grown.
I think of the informal economy as a political, economic, and social space that has been created by the law and the law's exclusions. We have a whole plethora of employment and labor law protections, and there are a growing number of workers who are not covered by those protections, and those people are informal workers.
So in the case of a day laborer who's working in the construction industry, they'll be hired off the books. Or you take the case of a domestic worker who may have a verbal agreement with their employer.
It could be braiding hair in your apartment. It could be washing cars in the neighborhood.
These are forms of the economy that are hiding in plain sight. But we often don't link these together. We don't see the day laborer, the domestic worker, the street vendor as inhabiting a similar set of employment relations. And so we often don't make these connections. And for that reason, we don't understand how vast the informal economy actually is.
Bueno, mi nombre es Caridad Vázquez, soy mexicana del estado de Colima, y tengo ahorita 59 años. Mi profesión es cocinera. De la edad de 8 años he sido vendedora ambulante.
Hola, qué chila.
Habanero. No, y también está picosa la verde, se me hace.
We've seen that people have had to participate in the so-called informal economy just to survive. Humans are naturally entrepreneurial and will find ways to essentially better their economic position, whether they're allowed to or not.
If you think about Los Angeles, immigrants have fueled that street vending economy and have supported their families by doing so.
Yo me casé ahí en Michoacán. Yo me enseñé a hacer tamales al vapor, yo me enseñé a hacer mole, yo me enseñé a hacer quesadillas, yo me enseñé a hacer todo lo que es un platillo tradicional de Michoacán. Toda mi familia saben lo que yo me dedico, saben a lo que yo hago y ellas me apoyan. Yo siempre quiero que mi familia quede bien.
Street vending brings people together. It activates a lot of spaces that would otherwise be lonely or be dark. There's more light on the street, there's more eyes on the street. But low-income workers, mostly women, were being criminalized every day for trying to earn a living and for trying to provide for their families.
Street vendors throughout the city of Los Angeles. The city estimates there are at least 10,000 such vendors on the streets every day, all of them operating illegally.
Street vending is like the wild, wild west because there are no rules or regulations.
The street vendor campaign began in 2008, and the women have definitely led this movement. They're the ones who came to us, and they're the ones who continue to fight the hardest.
Y digan que si quieren que se legalice o no, porque si no vendemos, ellos tampoco nos van a mantener. Porque de nosotros depende la economía.
Me gusta mucho el movimiento. Y pues ahora que me uní a la campaña de los vendedores, pues yo pedí ayuda, llegó ILAC, se mostró interés hacia nosotros y pues aquí estamos en la lucha.
They said, we're vending on sidewalks that are supposed to be public space. So why is it that the police are ticketing people on the sidewalks for just trying to make a living?
The battle over street vendors turns violent in Hollywood when a man flips over a food cart.
That moment, caught on video, has spread.
A woman clutching flowers as a Paris police officer tries to subdue her.
Somos dichos criminales porque nosotros vendemos en la calle. No porque no somos de este país, no tenemos derechos. Dependemos de nosotros mismos, dependemos de nuestro trabajo, dependemos de lo que hacemos. A nosotros nadie nos da dinero para seguir adelante.
Sidewalk vendors on the streets are not only already vulnerable because they have to adhere to local ordinances and sometimes even the police or harassment from police officers. And when you are a single parent or you're a senior citizen taking care of your grandchildren or your children, and this is the only way that you know to be able to provide for your family, every day they set up their stand is a day that they might not come back home.
It's imposing a huge cost on informal worker, and it's creating this sense of fear. And we don't see the same enforcement of existing laws in other sectors of the informal economy. We don't see employers being penalized in the same ways. We don't see consumers being penalized for purchasing goods that are produced informally. It's important to distinguish between the small entrepreneur that they may not have the permit and the workers that are hired informally by formal businesses.
We seem to be entering into another era where we're seeing more informalization and casualization of the labor market.
We always tout that California is the 5th largest economy in the world, but yet there's people who are not making ends meet.
I grew up here in Los Angeles in the South Bay area. I've been a truck driver for almost 5 years. One of my friends who drives over the road said, hey, come into the trucking industry. When I was introduced to this company, they stated that we're independent contractors. They said by this model, we can make tons and tons of money. We are the ones who are moving all of the cargo for all of your big companies as Walmart, Amazon, General Electric, Sony, all these stores that everyone goes shopping at. Us truck drivers are the ones who are bringing these goods that you need to have to eat, to clothe yourself, everything that you need. We don't have medical, we don't have Social Security, disability, we don't qualify. Which one was that? Oh. I'm paying the lease, the insurance, and also an escrow, and all these fees and stuff. They're taking like half of my check. They're putting the cost on us. I seen my paycheck, and I grew angry. That's a lot of money for every day that they're taking. So we started talking to other truckers. What's going on at your company?
We found some companies who were charging for the office toilet paper, for parking, for drug tests. Anything that the company needs to cover its own costs can come right from the driver's checks.
Why is it only the top % that's getting all of the money and not even leaving us with the livable wage? We're not asking for $1 million. We're just asking for a livable wage.
The only thing I can see for our little community over here and is spread the word out to other Samoan community who may not be aware of it, so that when there's a strike, we can all go out there and support.
The misclassification of port truck drivers, essentially they are our last indentured servants. They have no rights, they have no benefits, they have no protections.
We've been trying to figure out how to help these workers and help them organize and form a union and get some rights, but that's been very difficult. The industry has been very slow to change. They basically get paid by the load, regardless of how long it takes them for that load. They're typically working 12, 14-hour days. Sometimes they sleep in their truck and don't go home at night, and they get their check, and maybe it's $300. Sometimes they even owe the company.
In an independent owner-operator environment, it's cheaper to cheat. No question about it. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It is cheaper to cheat.
Good day to you guys. My name is Seko Waina, and I'm a misclassified port truck driver. How do I know? The labor board has said that we are employees. It struck me what the first gentleman said. It's cheaper to cheat. They're not only cheating us truck drivers, but our families that come along with it. They're worried about their money, their profit margins, to make sure that the prices at the stores are cheaper, but we're suffering, they're pressing down on us real hard. And that's why we're here to fight. And money is not worth a human life. Thank you.
From the very beginning of the labor history, we've had people who've not been protected. We've always tried to have a large supply of cheap, affordable, disposable labor to run the economy, to make the economy work.
The history of African Americans in this country specifically is really a study of the systematic dislocation of a population from the labor market, either through slavery or through the Jim Crow period. The country was built on cotton and tobacco. Many of our great institutions were built on the profits of that labor. So we've always craved that labor. But at the same time, we've feared actually giving that labor the full rights and privileges of, citizenship. The industrial era, a time in this country where there was rapacious capitalism and labor exploited to the extent that people were dying on the job.
There was no regulation, there was no 40-hour week, and it's not until the late 1800s or so that some social reformers started demanding that the government begin to protect workers.
When labor was in its ascendancy and the rights of workers was being kind of enshrined in laws, during that same period of time, African Americans were excluded from many of the major labor movements.
It's only when we started regulating labor and protecting labor that we started seeing this official sort of bifurcation between the formal and the informal economy. It's really not until the New Deal, which occurred in the midst of the Great Depression, that we started seeing more systematic regulation of work in the United States.
Of course, we will continue to seek to improve working conditions for the workers of America, to reduce hours that are overlong, to increase wages that spell starvation.
Roosevelt passed a number of laws that we now refer to as the New Deal.
The kind of security the American people want is a fair chance in life. The people of the United States have joined together in a great national program of protection for the common welfare.
What we did in America after the war, it was really we're all in this together. That had a lot to do with building the broad middle class post-World War II in this country. Workers could get a better, a fair playing field, but we were still leaving people behind then.
I want to just lift up my grandmother who passed away at 96. And she had Social Security, and her Social Security check was $12.90 a month. And she works from 11 years old until 90. My grandmother did not benefit from the New Deal because she was Black, she was female, she was a domestic worker. The New Deal did not include Black workers. Over 80% of Black workers at the time were in the domestic work. They were working in the kitchens and in the homes of white families. It did not include immigrant workers, Filipino and Latino farm workers here in California and in other parts of the country who were working in slave-like conditions. And so as the country moved into this golden age, there were millions of families who were left behind.
The systematic dislocation of people of color from the labor force, keeping people away from the ability to benefit from essentially their own work and entrepreneurialism. What that has done is it's driven people underground. One of the largest internal migrations in the history of the world. Over 1 million people moved from the South to the North and West to avoid the Jim Crow conditions in the South.
The Black Codes, Jim Crow, these were all laws that really worked to create new forms of bondage.
African Americans were picked up for relatively minor crimes, loitering, being unemployed, being homeless.
Many Black families came to California to escape a lot of that political persecution in hopes of a better opportunity.
When I talk to Black elders in Oakland, I hear stories about having worked on the Army base and having a good family-sustaining job and being able to buy a house. I hear about a thriving Black entrepreneurial community, the 7th Street corridor being a hub for Black businesses. And then folks talk about how the crack epidemic, the loss of good jobs, disinvestment in East and West Oakland and in Black communities just really devastated Oakland over time. And how we're in a position now with both still feeling the effects of those things and the fact that we're not replacing that with investment or good jobs. We know that mass incarceration disproportionately impacts Black folks and brown folks, and 1 in 4 Alameda County residents has an arrest record, many of whom are Black community members. And so having a fair shot at a job as folks are returning from incarceration is critically important to their success.
It is very difficult to get a job if you have a felony on your record because you're discriminated against. You're talking about people who had maybe accounting jobs when they're inside but get out and can't be accounting. You're talking about people who fought fires for our state and help homeowners save their homes.
That's right.
But get out and then can't get a job as a firefighter.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't make sense. I went to prison when I was 19 years old. I served 22 years in prison. When I first came home, it was extremely difficult to become stable. I remember entering into a workforce development program. It was a training for electrical technician work. I went through every training, aced all the exams, all the tests, getting clothing, buying boots, went through the driving school. And literally the day I went on site to work my job, they told me you've been terminated. I ended up getting a job in a metal shop, becoming a full-fledged machinist. Initially, I was getting paid minimum wage, and it wasn't enough to survive. I ended up driving for Lyft at least 8, 9, 10 hours a night, just stacking my money and stacking my money so that I can make a way out of that situation.
What we have is a situation where there are no jobs in the community, and because of this strike on their record, there's no future of a job. So it's the lack of access and then the lack of even having the opportunity to get access that our communities are facing.
People are not even getting enough money to survive. You know what I'm saying? Even in a full-time job. I recently was offered an opportunity to work with East Bay Alliance for Sustainable Economy. The work that I will be doing is policy advocacy work.
If you're starting to develop laws, use that sheet. That's where I pulled out.
We are trying to push the envelope so that any development in Oakland is development done with an understanding of hiring locally. I actually created a call center. And hiring fair chance and people who are impacted by the criminal justice system. That's something I love about the work that I do. I think I'm really gonna be hitting the ground running.
Yeah.
So I already have, again, like a presentation of what needs to be done.
There's a direct connection between mass incarceration and employment. This isn't because Black communities are somehow deficient. It's because the economic underpinning of our families completely disappeared. And in America, if you don't have an economic underpinning, you cannot survive.
You can find sidewalk food vendors all over LA. It turns out they're all illegal.
There's a new plan to legalize street vending in Los Angeles, but with new restrictions, too.
There's a battle brewing between those vendors and small business owners who say their money is on the line.
The vendors are asking city officials how they can make a living without getting arrested.
Request the city attorney to prepare and present an ordinance to establish a sidewalk vending program as approved by the council.
Los Angeles is the only major city in the U.S. that currently outlaws street vending.
And so this committee is studying ways to make street vendors legal.
We're going to begin with general public comment.
Hi, I'm a community member from Arleta. Now we're just overran by a lot of these vendors, and it's hurting our communities a lot. We got alcoholics coming in buying tacos, and it's unhealthy for our children.
The problem we have with the street vendors are cleanliness. They just do not follow the rules. We don't want it in our neighborhood.
A lot of these businesses, these street vendors, it's not what you consider an economic opportunity. It's more of a tax evading advantage because it's cash.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We've heard people say that street vending makes our city look like we're in a third world country.
When we hear these health and safety concerns about places like Hollywood,
There are larger business entities who are dehumanizing that experience. We're taking this very seriously. This isn't a joke. This is something that could actually hurt a lot of women.
Que hasta ahora se están dando cuenta que nosotros somos pequeñas empresas. No estamos registradas, pero sí estamos aportando a la ciudad. Así como